Thank you for joining today. We will be recording the call. If you have questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat, and we'll stop at certain points to answer those. And then we'll do some more Q&A at the end. Today we have Henrik Westergaard talking about Business Central, and then we also have Kyle Marsh, who will be doing an MSAL update. And with that, I will let Henrik go ahead and get started.
Yeah, hello everybody. I am the program manager for our integration points to Business Central. And I will basically walk you through shortly what is Business Central, as I assume that most of you are not familiar with Business Central. Also, we have a few ways to build solutions or integrate to Business Central. I'll go briefly through those. And finally, I'll do some of the demos of the APIs. Should be pretty straightforward. So I'm not able to see the chat. Please let me know if there's questions. I can either do it in between the presentation or on the chat afterwards. So basically what Business Central is, it's an ERP system for mid-market. So it's targeting companies from between 10 and 100 employees, which should have access to business data. We differ by making a all-in-one solution, so it covers a lot of different areas needed for running the business, such as project management, sales, operations, supply chain management, project management, and so forth. On top of that, we have a lot of partners doing extensions for Business Central or add-ons for Business Central for integrating payroll applications, banking solution, or doing vertical industry-specific solutions. So it's meant to be an all-in-one where you can install extensions to cover specific areas not covered out of the box. So so we've had APIs for quite some while, but recently we entered into the beta version in Graph. So roughly the areas we are covering within the different domains are how to access the chart of accounts and do journals, do posting to Business Central. We have quite some support for running the documents of the business, like the business documents such as quotes, invoicing, credit memos, sales orders, and so forth. Those are all exposed through the API. Recent additions are doing time registrations and posting jobs for tracking those. We have inventory and purchasing control and handling the cancellations and vendor management. That's roughly the scenarios we are looking into. So looking a bit higher level at Business Central, we strive to develop like this single comprehensive solution where you can basically connect to any other business application or line of business application there, or install on top of Business Central to tailor Business Central either to a vertical or do a horizontal extension on top, like payroll management or expense management or what have you. Obviously, we have integrations to Outlook, so you can manage some of the business aspects from within Outlook. This is basically the platform that we are building, so you can grow with Business Central because you can. It's highly customizable, as we know from the other Dynamics products as well. So when we look at the ways, the types of apps present in the ecosystem, one is the add-on, the extension you build and publish to app source, and you build that in a programming language called AL. And you deploy that extension to a tenant, and then it'll enrich the functionality in Business Central, either doing new tables, new pages, and also new APIs if you want to do your custom APIs. But that's in its own programming language called AL, and it has its own deployment model as well. So that's one type of extensions published to app source. Not so long ago, we introduced the Connect apps as well. Connect apps are those purely connecting to Business Central using APIs. So that would be other SaaS providers integrating to Business Central, consuming, interacting with data in Business Central. We see payroll providers, expense management, warehouse management solutions, and other solutions connecting and doing that. I think there's a third solution, which is kind of a hybrid solution. And that's where some other SaaS providers develop their own APIs and deploy those to Business Central to do deeper integration with Business Central than we expose in these standard APIs. So anyways, this third option is just for other SaaS providers to do deeper integration, doing their own APIs, so they can, from their SaaS application, interact with those APIs. So with the Business Central entering Microsoft Graph, I think that it's really where the three clouds come together, right? So this is an older picture I found, or of an already existing slide, where we have where we already accessing documents in OneDrive and SharePoint and so forth. But what Business Central really brings to the graph is like business documents, business data, such as creating quotes, tracking quotes, converting quotes to orders, and creating invoices and sending invoices, and all those aspects of driving a business on our in Graph with the Dynamics 365 cloud entering here as well with Business Central. So if we look at this one, I also expanded on this this slide as well. So we have, like, instead of just doing Office, Azure, and so forth, we now also have Business Central in the financials namespace of the graph, providing entities such as customer items like the inventory, vendors, employees, and documents, and much more. So if we do a quick tour of the APIs, so instead of using the Graph Explorer, I am using the Postman. So obviously this URL, I am in the Graph Microsoft.com. I have already authorized fetch the token and stored in this environment environment variable. So we are in beta in the financials, and always with Business Central, the root of the API is always a company. So everything you do on the APIs of Business Central are in the context of a company. So first thing you would need to do in order to interact with Business Central data would be to fetch the companies available on this tenant. So currently there's 2 companies available, a demo company and another one created. If you want to create additional companies, you need to do that either through the UI or on some automation APIs we expose directly on Business Central. Anyways, what I do here is I update. I just fetch the ID. So I do that a lot because these IDs for all the entities float around all the time. So for demo purposes, I just fetch the first ID of a response. So I'm fetching this and storing this, and obviously then I can fetch the different items. Now I'm fetching the specific ones. So let's look at the items. So that might be the inventory, the goods that you are selling. Again, in the better financials companies, and you need to address the specific company, and I'm fetching the items, and we see there's a lot of demo data items in there. For patching, obviously, if you want to update the inventory, you can do that by issuing the patch and then update the inventory property of a specific item. So we see a lot of e-commerce solutions checking inventory to figure out where the goods in which warehouse are they, and how many, and so forth, and then later on creating quotes or orders based on invoices based on these items. A central thing, obviously, is the chart of accounts. This is really the key of all bookkeeping. You need like accounts to do posting. Obviously, we expose these accounts. So if a provider needs to do posting against any ledger, any account, any journal, you are able to fetch the accounts and do your posting against these accounts. Okay, so employees as well. So let me flip back to the presentation just briefly to do a sample. The canonical payroll example would go something like: you have the Business Central tenant or the company, and the accounts configured within the company. You would, from a payroll, fetch those, and then from the payroll application, SaaS application, back to the Business Central, you would post a journal containing payroll informations, hence the journal lines. And it could, obviously, for a payroll sample, that would be employees for salary to do the payroll for. There's a dimension. There's a concept in Business Central of dimensions. That would be, you could have dimensions for departments, for roles, for whatever you would like. So So it's kind of a generic concept, so you can put dimensions on every entity and use that for reporting and bookkeeping. Say you want to post for example department codes or whatever. So let's look briefly at journals. Let's get the journals. So these are the journals already in there. I already created my journal. Let's do a new journal. I created a new journal called MJ2. I again lock the or store the journal ID, and then we can do an update to that journal. Say we want to pay out something to this guy. We want to post it to this account with this amount, and this is the dimension used. So I just post it here, and now it's posted to that journal. So what happens then is that goes into Business Central, and the book, the accountant can now do the further processing of this journal. So let's see. Let me find the journal. There's my journal. And now this is within Business Central. This is the salary we just posted to Bob. And basically the process from driving it now would be you go and do the posting, and then it goes into the ledgers. So that process of the posting that you just saw, we are about to expose them as bound actions on the APIs in the graph, but they didn't make it for this update. I expect all the bound actions to be on the entities very shortly. So one of the key things is obviously the lead to cash process, like driving the business, getting the money. So the things we support with the APIs already processed, and with the bound actions coming up very shortly, is like creating a quote, taking that quote, either canceling it or making an invoice out of the quote. If you want to execute that invoice, you'll post it and you can receive customer payments, update the customer payment entity on a posted invoice where you register that the money is coming from the customer. And you can also, if the customer wants to return something, create the sales credit memo. Same thing goes for order processing. Instead of doing the quote, you can do the order directly, and from the order you can call the bound actions, ship an invoice, and then the shipping document will be created, and the invoice will be created and put into the books. So this is some of the key scenarios for accounting, for driving these business processes. Now you can do it all through the APIs, still awaiting those bound actions, but I expect those to be there very shortly. I think this was the whirlwind tour that I had for Business Central, exposing the business APIs, the financial APIs to Graph. Does that lead to any questions?
Thank you. So there were a couple of questions, but look like they got answered in the chat. There's one about retrieving a photo of an Office 365 group in Graph for TypeScript, but
So I don't think this is Business
that's not
Central related.
correct. So it looks like, does anyone else have any questions based on what Henrik's been talking about on Business Central? Okay, a couple other questions, but no.
Yeah, so but anyways, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any scenarios or need any support on the APIs related to Business Central. Here's my contact information, and then we can take it from there.
Sounds good. And this will also be in the recording that we post after the call. So if you do think of any questions, you'll have the contact information to reach out.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, Kyle, you want to go ahead and share?
I will go ahead and do that. Hi, everybody. I am Kyle Marsh. I work on the identity division. We own Azure Active Directory, Active Directory, as well as all of the Microsoft accounts. So everything that has to do with Outlook.com or Xbox.com or Skype.com, etc. Those are all part of our infrastructure as well. We also actually are key infrastructure owners of Microsoft Graph itself. So our group is when you make that call to graph.microsoft.com, the first stop, if you will, of that request is to the systems, the software that we run, which does the initial look at authentication, etc. So I did want to talk about an update to where we are on the identity platform. The first thing I want to take a quick look at is, where are we trying to get to with all of this? To do that, let's go through a quick walkthrough of one of our new quick starts. And I just want to set the stage, if you will, for what we're trying to accomplish and where we're trying to get to. So let's start with a new app registration. An app registration is just how you as a developer say, I would like to use the Microsoft Identity Platform in order to handle the authentication and authorization for my solution. It's how you declare yourself for just that you're going to use our identity service. So let me go ahead and I'll start an application here. We give you 3 choices to start with that you do need to fill in, which is where are the users for this application coming from? The simplest answer for a single tenant, I'm building a line of business app for my particular company or a single company, is I want it all from one particular tenant. And that in this case, it would be the tenant I'm using to register the app. In that case, we will make sure that no one else signs into that app if they're not from that tenant. I can also say what I really want is anyone who happens to have an Azure Active Directory account, so any enterprise of one of our 21 million different enterprises who run Azure Active Directory, I'll take a user from any of those. And finally, I'll go ahead and do this one, which is I can take all of the people who have a corporate account, as well as anyone who has a Microsoft consumer-based account like Skype and Xbox, etc. So I'll go ahead and just start the registration here. I won't fill in the redirect URI because at this point I don't really quite know what I want there. And we go ahead and we give you opportunities to do things like what the branding is, the name, etc. of the application and which APIs you might use. I'm just going to jump right to the quick start here. And in this case, go right to our JavaScript quick start. What we do here is we do give you a little bit of information about how the system works. We're going to go through that a little bit. And we also we start saying, well, if you're going to support a single page web app, then you need to enable these changes in your registration. We tell you what they are, but we also make it a little easier for you and just let you have a button that makes those updates as well. So we're turning on implicit grant for our single page web app. And the sample I'm going to use, or the quick start code I'm going to use, uses this particular redirect URI. So I'll go ahead and make those updates to the registration, so I don't have to go back and make those myself. And then from there, I would go ahead and download our quick start project. I won't do that now. I've already done that. But I will go ahead and take a look at, here's the code changes I need to make to the quick start sample. These aren't really just illustrative examples. They're actually working with this particular registration. So I'll just copy those right out of this quick start. and go to the application here. So I've already said I've already downloaded our Quick Start app. I'll just replace the code that came with the download with this code that we copied from our configuration. Now, let's take a good look at what we're doing in this particular sample, or this Quick Start. So we do set up, here's the application I just registered, so that's its ID that tells the system which application is being worked with. The authority, in this case, where am I going to ask for my authentication and tokens from? We're using our common endpoint, which means it could be a consumer account, it could be an enterprise account. We're open to all types of those. We're going to call a Graph API as part of this sample, of course. So the first thing we want to do is simply get the user's profile information. So we're going to use the me Graph API. What's really key throughout this entire system of how we do our MSAL library, which is what we're going to use to do this authentication and login, is this concept of scopes. Really, scopes drives everything that you do and everything that you need to manage with respect to how you do your authentication and authorization calls. Everything else we're really kind of looking after for you within the library itself. So if we look here, I'm going to start up a new MSAL object. And in this case, I'll take that configuration that we have up above. So there's my client ID and authority. And then from here, there's a pattern that we're going to follow. The first thing we're going to do is log in the user. And you can see that the primary object here is those scopes that we just defined. So here are the scopes for the request, and that's what's driving my login experience. After we do that, we're going to put up a quick message and call the Graph API. This is actually a really interesting part of this Quick Start, is it shows the process we have in mind for you when you use the MSAL library, the pattern, if you will. So the first thing you do when you want to call any API is simply call to MSAL and say, I'd like you to give me a token silently. So acquire token silent. Again, that key parameter here is those scopes, or are those scopes that we requested. We're going to drive, and everything we do with user experience will be around this scope parameter. In this case, I'm just taking the ones I logged in with. And all I do here is I acquire a token silent, and then I go ahead and use it. I don't bother with my code figuring out where it needs to be cached and if it needs to be refreshed or anything like that. All of that's handled entirely by the library. All I need is I'm going to call a particular graph API. Here's the scope I would need to call that API. Give me a token for it silently. Under the covers, sure, MSAL is looking at, have we already got this scope or a token for this scope? Do we need to talk to the user again? All those kinds of things are being handled. Can we get it out of the cache? Does it need to be silently refreshed in one way or another? All of that is handled entirely by the library. So you don't really need to worry about what protocol we're using, what flow are we using. It's simply a case of, I need a token to call this API. And then you just immediately use it. You don't worry about storing it or caching it yourself. Now, if for some reason we have an area where, in actual fact, what has to happen is the authentication provider, the Microsoft Identity, needs to talk to the user, then we'll tell you, oops, we need to talk to the user. That could be because maybe the user hasn't signed in at all yet. Maybe this is a new scope that you're adding to your request that you hadn't seen before. Maybe their password has expired or something. So we may give a point where we do need to do a talk with the user, in which case you need to call us and say, well, go ahead and acquire a token with an API call that makes it okay for for us to talk to the user. And then again, you simply take that token you acquire and go ahead and use it. So that's all we're doing here in terms of the pattern we expect you to use in order to be able to sign in, authenticate the user, and call these Microsoft Graph APIs. So if I go ahead and run this app, what we'll do here is we'll get it started up here. We'll go over to our browser, start the app. I'll go ahead and sign in here. And of course, it picked up the identity I already had signed in, so it pops right to my permissions call. So this is what is a result of the scopes that were requested at the login time. So I'll just go ahead and accept this. Now notice that I'll go ahead here and we make the call to Microsoft Graph. I'm going to sign out here just so I can specifically go through a sign-in experience. So let's get this out of the way. Let's bring this up. So what we're going to do here is we'll sign in again. So I just signed in with the account I was already signed in with as an enterprise. Let me use a different account. And in this case, I'll use my my consumer account. So this is the same app running at the same time, so there's no difference in code. I'll go ahead and sign in with my Microsoft Outlook.com. Again, the nice thing here is I get to use, you can see here, here's what's popping up on my phone. I get a passwordless experience, right? So the user doesn't have to worry about passwords. One of the big initiatives, here's my regular consent screen. I'll go ahead and say yes, and the graph call will continue. One of the big initiatives we have at Microsoft across all of the things we're doing is really trying to drive the ability for developers and users to get out of the concept of having to deal with passwords. Passwords are an enormous problem for everyone. And just as a way of example, last May, back in 2018, which is the last numbers we published, we detected 4.6 billion attempts of people trying to sign in with credentials that they had stolen. That's just 1 month's worth of traffic. We also, at the same time, prevented something in the order of 200,000 password spray attacks where enterprises were being attacked using the password spray technique. So these are the kinds of things that happen with passwords. So we really want to get the world out of passwords. The nice thing about it is all you have to do is simply use our MSAL library, and we look after whatever technique, whatever advanced security that the enterprise wants to do, whether that's a passwordless thing like we just saw here, or whether it's using something like an MFA or what have you. All of that happens because the MSAL library and Microsoft Identity look after all of that for you. So that's really where we want to get to. If I look at things like how do we do passwordless, well, we offer actually 3 different ways. Of course, there's been Windows Hello for quite some time, and those of you who use Windows Hello do benefit from not having to use your password all the time. The authenticator experience we just saw now, both with the approval, one-time password kinds of operations, as well as just a passwordless authentication. And one I didn't show because it's really hard to show with just the screen is the FIDO2 work. But we do support all kinds of different ways here of getting the world to this password authentication. The great thing for you as a developer is there's really no difference in your code whatsoever. If you just want to sign in your user, or you want to make sure your application is ready for the more secure world that as we get to in a passwordless world, it's the same code for you. So what are the details that we're going through today? Well, we have released our MSAL libraries for .NET as well as JavaScript. We are in this transition time, if you will, as we bring more and more of our particular MSAL library implementations online. There are 2 components to our platform, two sort of broad-based components, if you will, that we do have a number of client libraries that we're producing to make it easier for developers, depending upon the type of language you choose. But they talk to something, one of our endpoints, and as a way to move forward on our, especially on things like our standards-based work. In the V1 timeframe, which didn't have the name V1, it was just our endpoint. We implemented a few things that the standards weren't ready for yet, that they hadn't been, the concepts had not yet been standardized. And in the V2 world, we have created a very standards compliant, in fact, certified standards compliant endpoint for your applications to talk to through MSAL. So the MSAL libraries we have released today are the JavaScript and the .NET desktop ones. We also have a number in preview, a couple of new ones that we just released in preview for the first time, I believe at Build, were the Java and Python ones. We also have an Angular one in preview, as well as a slate of mobile development MSAL libraries as well, both the .NET-based Xamarin one, as well as specific ones for Android and iOS. So our goal here is to have as many MSAL libraries. So Microsoft Authentication Library isn't really one library, it's a family of libraries, and we're trying to reach out to as many different developer platforms as we can in order to make it easier for you to write these applications. I will caution you, we do absolutely support the standards. As I said before, our V2 endpoint is a certified OpenID Connect endpoint. I would strongly encourage you to really go through a couple of choices here. If you're using a Microsoft Identity or an Azure AD shop, or you're using Microsoft Consumer Identities, clearly an easy choice for you is to use our MSAL libraries. If you're not and you're in a different library, a different development platform, say we're not doing, you're doing a language that we haven't covered yet, or it's only in preview, I would still strongly encourage you to find a library that's well maintained, that's OpenID Connect compliant. My last choice or last recommendation for any developer is to actually use the protocols themselves. Yes, we're standards compliant. I don't have an issue there. It's just simply the amount of work you have to be ready to do. There's a lot of transactional issues that go on as we do these requests for tokens, et cetera. And every time you look around, there's a new exploit found and a new mitigation that's been put into the standards. And this is the kind of work that your team will have to keep up to date with if you decide to do things at the protocol level. So we're fine with you doing a protocol level work, but it's work that you have to do, and make sure you stay up to date if you do choose to not use a library. One quick concept I wanted to cover was this concept of single sign-on, and what do you need to do as a developer for single sign-on support. Of course, our libraries look after this, but I do want to explain what's going on under the covers just a little bit, because I do find developers sometimes get hung up here. The first thing you've done is you've told your application that it's going to rely on Microsoft Identity in order to determine who the user is. So you make a request to Microsoft Identity. You might request, for example, I'd like to know who this user is. So under the covers, you're asking for an ID token. You're doing a login, and you ask for what we refer to as an access token or a token in order to call the Microsoft Graph API. What happens then is terribly important to this concept of single sign-on. A private conversation between the user and their identity provider takes place. You as a developer have no vision, no influence on that conversation itself. So that might be username and password. It could be an MFA. It could be something else. It could be passwordless. Whatever is the right way for the user to identify themselves against that identity provider is something that takes place, and you don't need to be a part of that conversation. So as a result of that conversation, which the standard says has to happen on a web surface, there are all these relics left over, cookies and session state, et cetera, that effectively keep the fact that this user has identified themselves to the identity provider. It's this web surface that drives the concept of what we refer to as single sign-on. The next time I ask for a token, it goes through that same web surface, and the user doesn't have to sign in because we see that they're signed in because of the state of this web surface. If another application wants to sign in and they can reach that same shared web surface, then they benefit from the fact that the user just signed into one app, and the second app they don't need to sign in again. So it's key for you as developers to make sure that the surface that you provide us to do that authentication and authorization is a shareable surface. If you choose to make your surface an unshareable surface, then you're really saying, I don't want my application to participate in single sign-on. So you sometimes wonder, why my users always have to sign in? Well, because you haven't chosen to provide to us to a shareable surface. Now, most of the time, this is looked after by the MSAL libraries. You don't have to worry about that. You do obviously have to worry if you've done something about protocol choice. The one key area I see lots of developers are making this choice is on mobile. The traditional way of doing mobile development is to use an embedded web view. It was kind of the first thing that was out. And it's nice for developers because that web view pops up. It's completely in control of their application. You put up something at the top, it's like a done. You're not losing control of a developer from the user having to move to a different process or a different view. The problem with the embedded web view is it's not a shared web surface. As a result, these mobile applications will require the user to sign in, even if they've just signed into something like Outlook or one of their other Microsoft Office apps, because it's an embedded web view. One step up from that is to start using the system browser. This is a reasonably new capability that the mobile platform providers have started to make available, and I know that some of them, for example, have been making changes to how they do this over the last few releases. But this does provide a shared web surface. So at least the applications that do use a system browser can all use a system browser together, so that they get that shared experience and single sign-on experience. However, we also have a new concept, or a different concept, on mobile. For our full conditional access support, there are lots of enterprises today really like our conditional access capabilities. So instead of saying this user requires a multi-factor authentication all the time, you might say, well, this user requires a multi-factor authentication if they're coming from these particular network locations, which maybe they haven't used in a while or never used, or they're accessing particular types of information or resources. So that the enterprise doesn't have to have a blanket statement that can be very much refined in when that these kinds of additional challenges take place. In fact, one of the nice things there is the ability to say, well, if everything's normal, say Kyle is signing in from his desk that he signs in from every day, maybe I don't require an MFA right then. But if he does start to sign in from a country he's never been in, with a device we've never seen before, maybe it's an unmanaged device, maybe there's something we detect that's wrong about the device, maybe I need to require an MFA, or perhaps we see that I'm using a credential's been stolen, so I need to reset my password, etc. All of that's driven by this concept of conditional access. But for us to get full support of a conditional access world with a broker with a device that's only a BYO device, the device isn't fully managed by the enterprise, we actually need to talk to another process on the system, which we refer to as a broker. It's either our authenticator or the company portal app, but it does allow us to share authentication in a different way, as well as additional device state. So you, as a mobile device developer, don't need to make this choice. And obviously, we strongly encourage folks to work with the broker. Now, the mobile platform developers or providers are doing lots of work in this area. I'm sure some of you have heard about the sign-in with Apple ID that was announced not too long ago. That's kind of interesting, and that's fine. It's just another identity provider. But what was really interesting to us is the enterprise SSO extensions that Apple's talking about. So this is a way for them to provide additional ways for us to get to that shared surface, if you will, in a similar kind of concept to say how the Windows does it with the web account manager, the ability for us to have a system managed shared web surface so that we could have a more secure and authentication shared web surface is really quite interesting. So there's lots of interesting work going on in those devices. So what really matters here for you as a developer when you're using MSAL? Frankly, it's all about your use of scopes. So we'll look after, you call MSAL, we'll look after popping up the web surface for you and so on. So what is a scope? What do we need it for? Well, we need it to call an API, right? So for example, if I set up a couple of scopes like this, I have a user.read and offline access, then I simply make an acquire token silent request, as we talked about before, and I use that token straight away. If we come back and say, no, the identity provider needs to get an additional consent prompt, or the user hasn't signed in yet, then we go ahead and ask that you provide give me a UI example of acquiring that token. And again, you simply use it right away. You provide that token straight away into the API call. You don't need to worry about caching it. You don't need to worry about refreshing it. You don't need to worry about managing it in any way. That's all handled directly by the MSAL library. Now, there's a key element of what's going on here with respect to scopes. When you ask for, hey, I want to use the user's profile with Microsoft Graph API, what you're really saying is my range of operation is I want to read the user's profile. Obviously, an API like Microsoft Graph has an enormous surface. So we want to be able to an application to say, here's the specific functionality I need, or range of operation I want to perform. In this case, I want to use a reader's profile. Maybe I want to be able to read the user's calendar, or update the user's calendar, or read their mail, etc. These are the different ranges of operation that a developer has implemented. The key here is that you should never ask for a permission for something that you haven't actually implemented. So there's no reason for you to say, well, I need calendar.read if you haven't actually written anything to make that function available. And then, of course, we have a particular identifier here for which API is that I'm asking for that range of operation. The way you do that is simply by requesting a scope. And when a developer says, here's my scope definition. I want to read the user's profile, and I want offline access so I can do this on an ongoing basis. When the developer writes this, this is the user experience that will happen. So while before I said that there's a private conversation between the user and their identity provider, that's entirely true. But you as a developer directly affect the elements of what that conversation is. So here, for example, because I added those two scopes, user.read and offline access, I got these two lines as part of that permission request. So it's the developer who really drives the experience that the user sees here by their use of scopes. Because this permission dialog pops up when you refer to scopes, you often find us talking about permissions and scopes interchangeably. Since the use of the term scope, I need a scope, we'll go through some permission and consent framework, UI of one description or another. So if I look at the primary scopes that we look at most of the time, it's about delegated permissions, meaning a user is present, you're operating on behalf of the user. In that case, in order for you to say, well, I want to work on behalf of this user, the user has to go ahead and authenticate. So for example, the simple one, the one that's almost universal, is I want to use the sign in and read the current user's profile. That lets me read their office number and so on, the idea of the current information about that user. You can also use, say, my application would like to be able to update the user's profile. Now, what you're asking for here when you say I need a delegated permission is, on behalf of this user, my application would like to be able to have the ability to update that profile. You're not saying anything about what the user is allowed to do. You're only saying what my application is asking permission to do. In other words, I've written this code as a developer. I'd like to be able to execute that code. So user.read is something we say, sure. Now, an individual user should be able to say, yes, I want to use this application to do that update. We have another permission, user.read.all. This becomes interesting because everyone in an enterprise can read all of the users in the enterprise. You only need to open Outlook and you can go up and down your report, your management chain to your heart's content. So every user in the enterprise has this capability, and yet if an application were to ask for it, we think this is a sensitive piece of information. If I'm an attacker and I have an application that wants to, do a better phishing attack, it's better that I find out who your manager is. So the mail you get appears to come from your manager, and therefore you might take a little less guarded look at that mail. So this is a very sensitive bit of information to us. So it's a permission that we decided, hey, you know what? An admin has to say whether an application is allowed to do that functionality or not. It doesn't matter whether the user can do it. We want to make sure that applications who have the ability to go throughout an enterprise and read that have admin approval. Now, if you go ahead and say, I want user.read.all, this is what your users are going to see. So you are, as a developer, controlling the experience of that sign-in or of that token request because you said, I need a permission that requires admin consent. Now, if I'm just a regular user, I might end up with something like this. It simply says, well, you're going to have to go ask an admin to get this application approved for the functionality that it's developed. If I'm an actual admin, then I would see something like this, where I would see an option here to consent on behalf of my organization. I could click that, and no one else will ever see this consent prompt for this app again. Or I could simply accept this for myself because I want to check out the app before I let it be available to the rest of the enterprise. I could also do, as an admin, do the same thing in respect to the application portal itself. So I could go to my management portal, look at my enterprise app, and say, oh yes, here's the application, here's the consent, it's done. At this point, I can see who did it and so on. I will point out as a best practice, this is a really good choice for any line of business developer. You simply go ahead and have your IT department pre-consent to this. It's also important that you as a developer, whether you're a line of business or not, always declare all of the scopes you really need in your application registration. So while it's not required, you don't need to put anything in the application registration. You can simply rely on the scopes you provide us at runtime. This helps an IT pro see what permissions you want and pre-consent to them. So for example, that application I just showed that was looking for user read all, this is its registration page. But they chose not to say, I need this admin consent permission in their registration. So I, as a IT pro now, can't pre-consent to it because they never declared that they were going to use it. So I still can control when and how the user sees that consent, but I should, as a best practice, make sure that I let my IT departments know exactly what I'm going to do by using the portal and declaring those consents. This is a new for our V2 MSAL functionality. We used to require that everything be listed here, and we would do what we refer to as a static consent, meaning everything in the that was registered in the portal is what will be popped up at first. We allow developers more flexibility now in our MSAL V2 world, but we still strongly suggest that you make these registration entries to help your IT department out. So one last note here about effective permission. Here's an interesting scope we have in the Microsoft Graph API, user.export.all. We declare right here in its description that it only works if the user who's executing this happens to be a company administrator. So I might write an application that says, well, I have this export functionality, so if you click on this button, I'll go ahead and export it for you. But if the current user doesn't actually have, isn't a company administrator, the operation will fail. That's really just an example of an effective permission. So the permissions that you are asking for with these scopes are what can this application is allowed to do. So the developer wrote some code. The developer says, I wrote the code that knows how to drive and export from the users out to another piece of Azure storage. But the admin has to say, yes, it's okay for this application to do that functionality. So all that says is it's all right for the application to be used this way. It doesn't say the user who's running the application gets to do it. That still comes down to whether or not, for example, in this scope, the user happens to be a company administrator or not. So that's what we refer to as effective permission. So your application works with the intersection of what the user is allowed to do and what the application is allowed to do. We also support, of course, the concept of applications that don't have users. These are daemon apps or services or what have you. They use the client credential flow. They provide either a client secret, a certificate, or if they happen to be written on Azure, they can use managed identity for Azure services. These have nothing to do with users. The application is simply granted this capability, and obviously the API designer needs to provide it. That says this application would be, for example, allowed to read everyone's information, everyone's calendar information in the enterprise. There's no effective permission here because everything goes directly to the application, that the permission itself. So when can you decide to drive this UI? Well, one choice is you could say, I still want to use static permissions. This was the default in the old V1 ADOL world. What you would do there is when you request a scope, you just say, I want the /.default scopes, meaning I want whatever's in the registration portal. And then when you do your login or your acquired token silent, you just request them, and it would happen immediately. The immediate consent would, of course, happen on that first login, and it's whatever has been registered in the portal. That's effectively mimicking the behavior back in V1. I can also decide, well, what I want to do is I want to decide at some point what permissions I want to do. Maybe I haven't declared anything in the portal. So I can say, well, here are the permissions I'm going to use, and I can just provide those again in those login pop-up and acquire token silent calls. So I could ask for everything I'm going to need as soon as the application starts. A final alternative as part of our V2 world functionality is incremental permissions. So I might have these initial permissions that I'm going to ask for, but then I might have an additional request. Hey, I also at some other point want to say, well, here's the first things I want to do. I'm going to read your calendar and read files, etc. And then this application may be looking at my OneDrive files and say, hey, I'm going to write a task for you that says, review the files that you put in the system 2 weeks ago to see if they should be changed or removed. So do you want me to add a calendar reminder for you? So you might ask the user, well, yes, I want to write your tasks now. So I might have logged in with only the original request, but when I go to acquire a token silent, I add this incremental consent saying, I would like a token to be able to write to this user's tasks. And at that point, the user will be prompted for the consent for that. It lets you help drive the usage of your app or the functionality of your app the acceptability of your app, because you acquire the permissions you need when you get to that operation. So it might make it a little bit less scary for a user to understand, oh, now I see why the thing that monitors my OneDrive files is asking to update tasks for me, because it just explained why it did that. So you as a developer have those choices. So that was just a really quick look through our MSAL world. We have these new releases, as I said. It does have some of these nice new capabilities like incremental consents and so on. So we will certainly encourage you to start looking and using MSAL as you move forward. Here's some contact information for you as well as a link to our documentation page.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate that today. There were a few questions, and one that seemed consistent through the threads as you were talking was specifically about the planning of permissions, especially if your app touched a lot of different graph APIs. What's the best way to plan it? Do we have any good doc guidance we could point them to of the different approaches? Because obviously you can pre-consent them all in the app registration portal, or you can kind of do it in code. But do we have any guidance on like if you do one way or the other?
I think we have some guidance on the permission page. Let me dig up a link and I can mail it out. But the simple rule of thumb, we believe for most situations, for most enterprises, pre-consenting in the portal is probably the easiest and best way to go.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're writing a line of business application, go ahead and fill out the app registration so the IT Pro can see what permissions your application uses, and then can simply grant that consent ahead of time. Oddly enough, I was at talking to a customer yesterday where one option was to simply make sure that always happens by saying I want admin consent, and then only one user ever gets hit with the consent prompt. But the nature there is to as a line of business developer, we believe the right answer in most cases is to use the portal and go ahead and have pre-consent done by your IT Pro. After that, it really comes down to, do you want to use incremental consent or not? We still believe dynamic consent is, you're going to declare the scopes you need, just simply by what you're doing in your API as opposed to static. But so static just says whatever's registered I want. We think the right move today for most application developers is to use dynamic and start with the core set of permissions in terms of the user experience at that point. So this is really where I'm talking about a multi-tenant application, an application that's running across different organizations, probably an ISV type application. And at that point, yes, we think the combination of dynamic and incremental, meaning you should ask for your core permissions to start with. And then if you have something, especially if it's a little more sensitive, like I'm trying a write operation, you give an opportunity for the user to understand why you're doing that operation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I know with the ISVs that I worked at, we had this notion of a trial first. And the trial we tried to keep in read mode so that more customers would accept those permissions without too many questions. And then if they wanted to try or use the entire product, then they would go through another process of approving write permissions like you just mentioned. So that's perfect.
Right.
We'll make sure we put those in the blog post when the recording goes out, Carl, as well. So I'll work with you offline on that.
Great. And one other thing I should point out is the proper use, if you will, or careful use of permissions and especially user consents. It's those applications that we found have become the most widely deployed applications or widely used applications across our customers. Frankly, it's the digital assistants, right? All they do is you run your digital assistant app so that you can say, well, when I say, Alexa, when's my next appointment? It comes from my corporate calendar, not from my personal, because if you're like me, I don't put anything in a personal calendar. I just use my corporate one. So if I'm doing that, they've successfully found their way into tens of thousands of tenants just by making sure that it's a user consent thing. They're not trying to do any more than what they've coded for, and it makes your application incredibly easy to get adopted across lots of enterprises.
Awesome. Again, thanks very much for presenting today, Carl, and we'll have another monthly call in September. It's again the first Tuesday of every month, so it's the 3rd of September we're having this call. I'm still lining up speakers, so just keep an eye on the Office Dev Twitter handle and the Microsoft Graph blog. And have a good rest of your day, everybody.